Hey
Welcome to
guys.
Layer the Alchemist, and welcome to another edition of Dudes Talking Metal. This is where we get together with you to get some dudes together to talk about heavy metal with you. And continuing kind of from our last episode, we've got Butch is here, Martin's here, and we're going to continue along the same theme. Last episode, we did the 10 heaviest, what we felt were the 10 heaviest albums to come out of America in the 70s. Now we're each going to pick who we think is the most important, impactful, maybe heavy band to come out of America in the 70s. I kind of wanted to phrase it this way because as you saw on our list from last week, and Butch, you mentioned this on the last episode, that there were a whole bunch of really obscure bands that you can pick out that maybe they do have heavy records, but we wanted to kind of say, okay, who's the band that like had an impact? Who was the heaviest band that was influential, that really made a statement, if you will. So, okay, thanks guys for joining us here with Dudes Talking Metal. Martin, you want to give us your pick for
Sure.
your
I
band?
think, I think I'm going to go with Kiss. Because, interviewing lots of rock stars over the years, it's the band that comes up the most as that band that got them into doing what they're doing. Um, Kiss Alive was an absolutely manic, incredible time when that came out. Same with Destroyer. You have the whole situation with the Kiss Army starting up. There's the lead up to Alive with 3 albums. There's just Kiss being on top of the world. They weren't the band selling the most records, but they were a band selling certainly a lot of tickets, and they were a band, sucking up all the oxygen in the room in terms of press. In this realm, in our in our cream hit parader and circus bubble, so to speak. Because they put out 2 records in 76. They've got the four solo albums together in 78, along with Kiss Alive 2 in 77. They've got Love Gun in 77. They get an album out in 79. They're just pervasive. They're everywhere. But yeah, it's the band that I would hear when interviewing rock stars. I would hear Beatles on Ed Sullivan, and I'd hear
Mhm.
Kiss, basically. Those are the two most influential things that turned young kids into rock stars. So um, I think they're the most influential. I mean, I could almost go with Van Halen, but Kiss just has this much longer history. First album in 74, lots and lots of records all the way to the end of the decade. They just seem to be ruling. And as the years go on, I find people are forgetting a little bit about Aerosmith and Ted Nugent. Um, and While Blue Oyster Cult is such a cult band that all of us still talk about them a lot, but out there in the wider world, they're absolutely forgotten. But yeah, it's funny how Aerosmith and Ted don't have that. People don't talk about them as being so super important as Kiss is, and Kiss, of course, is changing all the rules of what a live concert could be, like just expanding the whole thing with the pyro and the leather and the makeup and the breathing fire and all that stuff. So yeah, absolutely. I think for me, the answer to this is going to be Kiss.
Can't argue with that. I would say that Kiss, too, I wouldn't call Kiss a heavy metal band, but they are closer to being a heavy metal band than like Aerosmith or Ted Nugent, where Aerosmith and Ted Nugent are. See, it's funny with Kiss. If you were to put together Butch, you picked Alive on our 10 heaviest from the 70s. When you stack them all up, there's some really heavy Kiss songs. It's just that they're not all on one record except for Alive. But when it comes to the studio records tend to only have three or four really like kind of proto metal type of songs. Whereas when I think of Ted Nugent and Aerosmith, they fall more in sort of the hard rock side of the spectrum. Although I will put Ted Nugent harder than Aerosmith. But yeah, if Kiss had only take the heaviest songs from the first three records and put them all on one record, wow, that would be one really heavy record. But there's no denying that our very first Martin, we did our first episode of Dudes Talking Metal, and it was our hit, our uh, earliest metal memories, and pretty much all of us had a Kiss story, because
Yeah.
if you're of a certain age, you can't get away from it. I mean, Kiss was just everywhere. It was just everybody was taught. Everybody has a Kiss story from their youth, you know.
Have
So
you
there's
guys heard my Kiss story?
it's great. I've heard it,
I've
but I
said it
love it.
so
So
many
if you want to
times.
tell it
So,
again,
well, okay. So I'll try to truncate it even more because I've told it so many times. But yeah, we put on a dance in 1975. So we would have been 12 years old in my parents' basement, and Forrest Toop and I, my other crazy metalhead buddy, were at the dump and just picking through crap at the dump, and we're walking up the big sand dune to get up there, and right at the front, as on the road going in, there's this box sitting on the floor on the sand, and it's full of pristine, untouched April 1974 live posters, which is the cover of that April Wine live album, the purple and black one where they
Yeah.
look so evil and heavy, right?
Yeah.
So it's that thing in a beautiful poster, and we thought, we got a dance coming up. Let's take these back. And we put those posters around all the walls of this big room in my parents' basement, cutting out for the plugs and everything. Right. So I wish I had a picture of it. I have one copy of that poster left. But we had hundreds of these posters rounding the entire walls. It looked like a crazy drug den. Right. And so we were running this dance, it's like right after school. It's 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon, right? And the girls are there, and we're all dancing, and we're playing Elton John, Crocodile Rock for them and stuff, and a lot of this pretty goofy music. And then Bobby Davidson runs in the room, holding aloft a copy of Kiss Alive. Just picked it up downtown, late for here, had to go downtown for a doctor's appointment or whatever, right? He comes in with that, and we just all dogpile on top of him, and he's holding this thing out like this so it doesn't get ruined, right? And then after that, just tear off the cellophane. Just all the guys crowd around the stereo. We're just looking at all the bits and pieces, playing this album, and we just turn around and look up, and all the girls have gone home, right? It's like, oh, what happened here, right? So that's my cool kid story.
in an alternate on another YouTube channel, there's probably a group of girls telling a story about how some guys ruined an after school dance with some ridiculous, Kiss record or something. That's a great story, Martin. I love that
Love
story,
it.
because for the guys, that's like, April Wine posters all over the wall. The girls will love this.
Yeah, they're probably scared to death, right? Yeah. Because I don't know if you guys could picture that poster, that album cover,
Yeah,
but that April Wine live album from 73 is black and purple. It looks like a rock and crazy band. It looks like kind of Inagata Davida, right? But even worse, even more
Yeah.
evil looking, right? And so it's this big, beautiful poster. And
love it.
you guys keep talking. I'm gonna see if I can find it, show it to you.
Okay. All right, Butch, what do you got for your band?
Well, you can make a lot of arguments for several bands. At the end of the day, the biggest U.S. hard rock and metal bands, the bands that had the most success in the '70s were. It always comes back to Aerosmith, Kiss, and then Van Halen. In terms of pervasive and ongoing influence, Ted Nugent was big, but once the '80s hit, he kind of like faded, and he never really came back except for that blip on the radar with Damn Yankees, which it's not really known as such for as much for Ted as and he's still.
Let me interrupt you for a sec. I'll just show
do
this
it
quickly. So that's the album cover, right?
Yeah.
And this is the poster.
Nice.
That's awesome.
Kameko Arena, that's our arena and trail. And Rock Island Tape Center is the place I started working from like 13, 14 years old, lugging console TVs up and down the stairs and running the record section. So that was our thing, 450. So yeah, just imagine. Oh yeah, look, and then I drew a blue BOC logo on the back in felt pen. But yeah, imagine a pristine box like that thick with this poster, just untouched. The guy got lazy and didn't put them up, right? threw him out at the dump. So
And that's one of
anyway,
the originals that came from your
yeah,
basement wall?
yeah.
Wow, that's some history
That's
right there.
awesome.
All right, so you were saying about Ted Nugent, I believe, or Aerosmith?
Yeah, I mean, there's a handful of bands from the United States that were, undeniably important and successful and influential in terms of, advancing hard rock. And, if you want to really get on the fringes of it, you could throw ZZ Top in there too, Blue Oyster Cult, obviously, even though their albums are, border, some of them are, some of the stuff, they're always like a mix of like heavy and then just odd kind of songs, like, but honestly, at the end of the day, I mean, it's hard to deny the influence that Kiss had for all the reasons that Martin just said. I mean, musically, maybe you don't see their DNA in as many bands as you see Aerosmith or Van Halen, who certainly, like, those two bands alone, like, you could say that the bands that came out of LA, or the bands that were big in the 80s, that a lot of them either had a decidedly Van Halen kind of vibe, your Guns N' Roses, or decidedly Van Halen kind of vibe, um, one of the two. I mean, musically, Eddie Van Halen set off like a guitar playing explosion. I mean, you can't deny those things. And both bands were huge and sold way more records than Kiss did. But I mean, in terms of, like Martin said, I mean, you could go through like almost every checkbox of why Kiss would have been the most important band of the '70s. I mean, everyone knew who they were. I mean, so many bands they influenced more kids to pick up guitars and start playing drums and sing than anyone. I mean, they were just, again, the Beatles of their time, really, in terms of just having this image, these four individual personalities, like they had everything going on, in all the magazines, everyone knew who they were. Huge live draw. I'm just repeating, they changed the way the concert business was done. I mean, I just watching another show, or was part of one, where or reading an interview, like, bands never had, their name up in lights behind them. I mean, Kiss, like, they took things that bands had maybe thought about doing but hadn't done, and like changed the way that you look at a live show. You could see Kiss's, fingerprints in Taylor Swift today. Like, these huge shows. I mean, there were bands that had imagery and had big productions. Bowie and Cooper obviously did, but in terms of bombast and just like huge sets and things, you can't deny that, you know their influence there. They influenced the way bands market themselves. They influenced the business of it. In every aspect, Kiss had their hands in it, and uh, you know again, didn't sell the most records, but when people think of the big bands of the '70s, Kiss is, undoubtedly one of the top five. You love them or hate them, you can't deny that they were huge. They were the band for a while, and so I don't know. I'm a little bit biased. They're one of my
Mhm.
favorite bands, but I mean, looking objectively at it, you
Hard to
know,
argue with it,
who
yeah.
it's hard to. Again, you could, like I said, you can make an argument for Aerosmith or Van Halen. I think would be good options because of what they did. I just think they didn't have the same impact, like, on the other end of things. Like, you didn't see Aerosmith getting involved in, like, they weren't a band like, oh, Kiss is making a movie, albeit terrible, but you didn't see Aerosmith other than like a brief showing in that terrible Sergeant Pepper movie, like, doing these things that Kiss did. Um, so yeah, I have to agree with Martin.
Okay.
Kiss was definitely the one, and definitely if you took. I just want to say quick too. John. You were mentioning about taking all their heavy songs and put them on one record. Had Kiss not, the argument's always made that by people that hate the band, that had they not worn the makeup, they wouldn't have had any success, or all their success is due to the show. And maybe some of that, maybe some of the, I mean, you can't deny that the show had a lot to do with them getting the attention they did. But had Kiss not worn the makeup, I maintain, I've said for years, and I maintain to this day that had they not worn the makeup, they'd be one of those bands that the same people that rip on them, they'd be if they just wore jeans and t-shirts and put out those first three records, people would be raving about the riffs on those records, the way they talk about Pentagram or some of these
Yeah.
old bands. They'd be like, "Oh, you got to check out this band. Listen to the riff on well, listen to Watching You or listen to She. Like, how heavy is that?"
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
True.
Neat.
All right. Well, before I give mine, Darren from our Sabbath Sunday, he also picked Kiss, and he says Kiss were the Beatles of Generation X. Kiss is also one of the best-selling bands of all time, having sold more than 75 million records worldwide, including 21 million RIAA certified albums. They have earned 30 gold albums, the most of any band from the United States. Wow, that's a little piece of trivia that I didn't know. And Tony wasn't able to join us this week. He was here last week, but I recorded something with him separately, giving us his band pick. So we'll check that out right here.
Hey, so my most influential band of the 70s, my pick is going to be Van Halen. I thought about Kiss, but I was like, I know Kiss was very influential to, especially to get a lot of people to start playing instruments when they were kids, they got into Kiss. But I think Van Halen was more influential in the long run because of Eddie Van Halen and his technique. He inspired so many guitar players and changed the face of guitar playing. You had Alex's just dynamic drumming that was very influential, and you also had the frontman guitar player duo of David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen, and I think that was very influential going into the '80s because we're going into the Sunset Strip era, even into the thrash metal era, everything. I think they were so influential. And since this is the '70s, my go-to props today are the two 8 tracks from the '70s, Van Halen 1 and 2. Sure. So that's my pick.
All right, that was Tony with his pick, and for mine, I'm gonna be okay. I'm gonna go Van Halen just for argument's sake because I figured that everybody was gonna pick Kiss. The reason why I picked Van Halen, and I'm not gonna argue about Kiss. I mean, I agree with everything that everybody said. You do not have the whole LA hair metal, glam metal, whatever you want to call it, LA scene without Van Halen. Without Eddie Van Halen, I don't think there's a single guitar player in the world of hard rock or heavy metal after what year did the first album come out? 77?
78.
78.
78.
From
February
78
10th. Yeah.
on, every guitar player was influenced by Eddie Van Halen. It's kind of like when Jimi Hendrix's Are You Experienced came out. Just everybody was affected by that. Eddie Van Halen, every hard rock and heavy metal guitar player has, from that point on, has some Eddie Van Halen in their lineage, even if it's not 100% directly. David Lee Roth's influence on the frontman, the whole LA frontman thing, even if the guys don't directly say it, they are in one way or another. It all comes back to Dave, whether it's and granted, Dave didn't invent this. He stole some of his look from Black Oak, Arkansas, and the scarves maybe from Steven Tyler and stuff like that. But still, uh, Diamond Dave, the whole vibe, the whole Van Halen, California. I mean, they just own the West Coast really from 78 on, and just the sound, even the background harmonies, I think are influential with what the LA bands and all the hard rock bands, radio rock bands started trying to do. And it even spilt over into look at Eddie Van Halen played on Beat It. I mean, the Van Halen sound even spread out beyond just sort of the LA hard rock world. I mean, Eddie Van Halen is, might even argue that he's as big, if not even a slightly bigger game changer than Jimi Hendrix was for his instrument. So for that reason, I totally agree with Kiss that they are a hugely impactful band. Uh, And the other thing too, I'm going to say this, I say about Van Halen, Kiss for me draws a lot of their sound almost from like 50s, 60s rock, you know, Lover All I Can. And there's a lot of songs that sound like they're like kind of 50s, 60s rock type tunes. Whereas Van Halen was more of a, you know, even though they're based in rock and blues, they're more of a forward thinking band. And I just think musically, Van Halen just changed the landscape. Kiss did it they did inspire people, but I think it was the inspiration from Kiss came more from the makeup and the stage show and the songs too. But Van Halen just changed the sound of American hard rock from that point on, and it just spilt out into so many different areas that I wanted to put them as my pick for the number one band. So
And of course, the intersection of Kiss and Van Halen is the Gene Simmons, like seeing these
yeah,
guys in a club and wanting to work with them, producing a bunch of demos for them. And, I'm sure Van Halen was going to get signed regardless of that. But it's just interesting um, the way that, even with that Gene Simmons somehow found his way to get his fingers into the makeup of the situation there.
yeah, yeah. He seemed to be a good judge of talent. You know, he was one of these guys that, and like you said, I think Van Halen would have exploded one way or another. But they're a band that I often forget that their first album is '78. I always think of them as an '80s band, but they were really ahead of that curve when it
Same.
came to that whole sort of, radio, hard rock, LA type of sound. So,
That came out the first the same day as what you call the first metal album. That came out the same day, February 10th, 78, as Stained Class.
oh, right. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I always say that on the European side of it, and I don't think there's an equivalent of this on the American side, but yeah, Stained Class is the first real pure top to bottom shiny metal record. And I would say that the first Van Halen record is the first of that sound that, I wouldn't call it metal, but I would call it that 80s hard rock sound. That's sort of the big bang for me. And you say, it wasn't totally created in a vacuum. Yesterday and we mentioned these on our list from last week, Yesterday and Today and Montrose and stuff. Those are all what sort of led up to that first Van Halen record. But to me, that's where all the chemicals, it all just ignites. The characters and the chemistry within the band and everything is just right, and it just sets rock music off into a whole new direction. So
It is interesting that the Van Halen, although you could definitely hear, there's, you got Ice Cream Man, and there's bits and pieces of like that more like, rock and roll, bluesy kind of vibe in bits and pieces. But really, like you said, I mean, Van Halen, like, just pretty much divorced hard rock of like being a totally like bluesy, three, your,
mhm.
your basic, chugga kind of thing. Like, and creating, you don't have a band like Talkin or some of these bands that you can directly trace their sound to what Van Halen was doing. They a lot of those bands from LA, Y&T eventually went more in that direction than
Yeah, it even
not
pulled
so
some
much
of the
25
older
hours a
bands
day.
and
It
that,
was more
yeah.
Mean Streak, and yeah,
Yeah, it's like Van Halen even sort of pulled the older bands in their direction because it was just such a big seismic shift. It was such a big bang, that first Van Halen record, that it even drew some of the '70s bands towards that sound because it became so huge. So, all right, well, there
sure.
you go. There's our pick for the three our picks for the heaviest most impactful, most important American hard rock heavy metal band from the '70s. So let us know what you think of our picks, Tony's picks, Darren's pick. Let us know in the comments down below. Thank you again, Martin, for joining us here at Dudes Talking Metal.
Absolutely.
Hopefully, I'm sure we'll see you again here at the future at some point. Thanks, Butch, and we'll see everybody at
Thank you.
the
All
next
right.
one.